On this channel I talk a lot about tragic events of the past, tragedies, radiation accidents, and other historical facts. In this video I have collected the most interesting facts that I have previously posted on my channel. Make yourself comfortable, enjoy watching.
The Security Service of Ukraine, SBU, has released some secret documents about the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant from its archives. This is an unprecedented event for the so-called CIS countries and a very good step in the realization of what the Soviet authorities were like. Many of the documents in the archives concern the Chernobyl plant and the liquidation of the consequences of the accident in 1986. They confirm many conjectures, which were earlier speculated, that the plant was built with serious violations of technical regulations, that the real consequences of the accident were deliberately concealed by the authorities, which also prevented normal follow-up work, that the commission had no accurate information about the condition of the reactor remains, and that the cleanup operation was largely an illiterate and unreasonable undertaking. In this video I will tell you what is included in these declassified documents and what horrible truth has been hidden from us for all these years. This video will be in two parts. This is the first part. On April 26, 1986, as a result of explosions, the fourth power unit, which was located near the Ukrainian city of Pripyat, was completely destroyed. Radioactive substances spread for kilometers around. More than 115,000 people were evacuated from nearby areas. Among the documents published are the very first report on the explosion, prepared by plant director Viktor Bryukhanov, as well as talks by plant operators at the time of the accident. Even 35 years after the terrible tragedy at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, unknown pages remain in the chronology of those events for most people. But millions of those whose lives were changed by the accident should know the truth, and the whole world should remember its consequences. The State Archive of the Security Service of Ukraine publishes secret KGB documents, the SSU said in a Facebook post. Moscow, May 9, 1986. At a press conference on the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, it was announced that radiation levels of up to 150 microroentgen per hour were recorded on the border of the 30-kilometer zone on May 8. The book Chernobyl KGB Dossier, which until recently collected archival documents sealed as secret, published a reference of the Ukrainian SSRU KGB stating the real level of radiation. In the city of Poleskaya located on the border of the exclusion zone, the air radioactivity at that time was 3,100 microroentgen per hour, and the soil 4,900 microroentgen per hour, while in Kiev radioactivity in the air at various points ranged from 500 to 1,050 microroentgen per hour. At the same time, the radiation background is safe for human health and amounts to about 20 to 30 microroentgen per hour, up to a maximum of 50. The collection, published by the Institute of History of Ukraine together with the Branch State Archive of the Security Service and the Institute of National Remembrance, contains data that has not been published anywhere else. The book, which is more than 1,000 pages long, helps to reconstruct not only the picture of the tragedy itself, but also to understand exactly how the command and control system of the USSR worked, in which reports and assessment of events by special services became more important than expert opinion, and fear of the truth became stronger than fear for life and health of people. Here is a quote from a report for the 6th Department of the KGB of the Ukrainian SSR for the city of Kiev and Kiev region, 25 hospitals, referring to the directive of the Ministry of Health of the Ukrainian SSR. In the medical histories of patients with signs of radiation sickness indicate a diagnosis of vegetavascular dystonia. In the opinion of A.M. Klemenko, head doctor of the regional hospital, such a formulation of the question may subsequently lead to confusion when prescribing treatment, diagnosis, as well as deciding the issue of disability and establishing a pension. This diagnosis, vascular dystonia, is known to many residents of Kiev. Moreover, one could get a higher dose of radiation in the capital of the Ukrainian SSR at that time simply by going from a house in a less contaminated area, for example, to the lakes on the outskirts. The decontamination, according to archival documents, was done at night, as all this data was classified at the time. No one informed Kiev residents about these radiation spots. Just as they did not inform all residents of the USSR about the real radiation level during and after the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. At that time the KGB of the USSR was more concerned with secrecy, as can be read in the archival documents of that time. What this care was expressed in is said in the report of May 15, 1986. The newspaper Pravda Ukraina published a positive interview about the situation in Kiev with a representative of a French travel agency named Rita in the documents. In general, the presentation of information only in a positive vein was concerned almost daily. Such interviews were aimed at showing how good everything was in the Soviet Union, that tourists could come to Kiev and not get sick, says Oleg Bazhin, the compiler of the collection of documents, historian. In almost every report on the situation after the Chernobyl accident, foreigners are given inordinate attention and energy, contrary to the need to save their own population. Members of the security services listened to and recorded daily conversations with foreign nationals who were in Kiev at the time, mostly students and tourists, and regularly conducted explanatory work with them. This resulted in British students who were about to leave Kiev suddenly deciding to stay, and in groups of foreigners who had come to study Russian, doubts were sown about the need to leave the city, even though embassies and reports in the Western media recommended the opposite. Many Muslim students, who studied mostly in technical fields in Kiev, believed that the Chernobyl accident was God's punishment. In a report dated May 30, we can read how Hadra Jaber, a student of the Kiev Civil Engineering Institute from Lebanon, spoke about the accident. God who punished the communists did it. The KGB had its own informants at various industrial enterprises and universities. These people were engaged in monitoring public sentiments. After the explosion at Chernobyl, 67 agents were engaged, who collected information to identify the real causes of the accident, but at the same time they were given the task to suppress panic rumors, dissemination of anti-Soviet statements. Therefore, there were people at the grassroots level who on behalf of the KGB were looking for, as they were called in the documents, chatterboxes, with whom preventive work was carried out. Twice a day, the district department of the KGB broadcast information about how many people incorrectly interpreted the party's policy and expressed their attitude toward what happened. Teachers and students were silenced, erased writings on the walls, and collected leaflets, which at the time Kievers left on the streets, eager to tell the rest of us what was going on. They also resisted the work of foreign journalists who collected the truth about Chernobyl and were not allowed to film in the exclusion zone. There is evidence in the documents of how strongly the KGB agents patronized the CBS TV crew, how they forbade the American embassy employees to take soil samples in Kiev and in the exclusion zone in order to understand the true level of radiation contamination. There were a lot of examples. There were manuals that said what you could talk to foreign journalists or scientists from abroad about. In these conversations, the idea had to be imposed that the cause of the explosion at Chernobyl was personnel error, not machinery or equipment. This was the main idea the KGB had to get across to people, says Bazhin. If you recall the trial that took place directly in the disaster area after the accident, as we now know exactly from the documents, so that the presence of Western journalists was minimal, the entire blame for what happened was placed on the plant workers. The version of design flaws in the RBMK reactor itself was considered in passing. At first, the staff negligence as the cause of the accident was the main focus of the IAEA report, which was based on the data provided by the Soviet Union. But later, even the International Atomic Energy Agency issued an updated report, which said that the plant staff was not aware that the reactor could explode under certain actions. Academician Valery Legasov, who was on the government commission investigating the causes of the Chernobyl disaster, and plant employees who believed the reactor design was the main cause of what happened, also spoke about this, as some of them said in court. Historian Oleg Bazhin calls the trial of those responsible for the disaster simulated. The KGB planted a so-called rooster in a cell with the director of the Chernobyl plant. This agent was supposed to influence Viktor Brukhanov so that he would testify in the right way. Each cell was bugged in order to monitor the mood of Anatoly Dyatlov, deputy chief engineer in charge of Chernobyl operation, one of the 6 people convicted in the accident case. The documents mention surveillance of the plant's chief engineer, Nikolai Fomin, who testified at the trial against his direct superior, Dyatlov. The agent's reports contain the opinions of a large number of people about what happened, which gives an idea of how total surveillance of Soviet citizens was. There are statements by professors and assistant professors at several institutions of higher learning, magazine editors, writers, doctors and hospital managers, locksmiths, and handymen. As a rule, these are disgruntled comments that it was not reported in time, that informing the population was belated, that kindergartens of the Central Committee and the Council of Ministers were taken out back on April 27, while our children are sitting, that if it were not for the West, we would still know nothing. At this time, Special Services employees find leaflets about the consequences of the Chernobyl accident, which unknown people leave in phone booths or simply scatter in the street. In the second part of the video, I will continue to familiarize you with materials of this terrible tragedy. If you're interested, thank the author by putting a like. And also do not forget to subscribe so as not to miss the outputs of even more interesting videos of my channel. Turn on notifications by clicking on the bell and share this video with your friends. What else interesting can you add to this video? Write in the comments, it will be interesting to read.
According to official data, the Soviet spacecraft Soyuz 18 went into flight on May 24, 1975. The crew included two cosmonauts, Vitaly Sevastyanov and Pyotr Klimuk. The ship docked at the Salyut 4 orbital station. The crew stayed on board for 2 months. On July 26, the astronauts returned safely to Earth, and that could have been the end of it. However, not many people know that Klimchuk and Sevastyanov's ship had a slightly different name for the initiates, Soyuz 18B. What happened to Soyuz 18 was strictly forbidden to space industry workers. No one knew that the flight of this ship added to one of the dramatic pages of Soviet astronautics. The crew experienced terrible and difficult moments. No one else had such an ordeal. Vasily Lazarev was appointed pilot of the ship, and Oleg Makarov was appointed onboard engineer. Back in 1966, Makarov was selected to join the team that was preparing to land on the moon. Unfortunately, this project was soon abandoned. The Soviet Union lost the lunar race to the Americans. Lazarev and Makarov, who made an excellent crew, were transferred to other space programs. According to experts, it was one of the best-trained crews, capable of performing the most difficult tasks. In January 1975, Makarov and Lazarev were appointed as doubles for the crew of Soyuz 17, Georgy Grechko and Alexei Gubarev. According to tradition, the understudies were to go into space next. The launch of Soyuz 18 was scheduled for April 5, 1975. After launch, the separation of the first stage took place successfully. Then the payload fairing was jettisoned. The separation of the second stage should have taken place on the 4th minute of the flight. However, the crew felt that the rocket began to rock violently. The amplitude increased with every second. The astronauts realized that the carrier, having failed to reach the designed orbit, failed. Then the emergency system went off, which blew away the re-entry vehicle. The accident occurred at an altitude of 200 kilometers, that is, practically in space. The apparatus descended in unguided mode, in other words, the astronauts simply fell out of space. Under such conditions, the crew experienced tremendous overload, which posed an enormous threat to life. According to recollections of Vasily Lazarev, he could not move, the sensations were such, as if a car ran over his chest. Later Lazarev also recalled, "Once on a centrifuge I transferred a load of 10 g to my partner. After that, I saw many red dots on his back. I drew the attention of the doctor accompanying us to this. The doctor calmly answered, 'It was a bursting of blood vessels, the same thing on your back.' During the fall the crew felt a load of 20 g. Later, specialists analyzing telemetry noted that the load at some point reached a monstrous 26 g. At that point, the astronauts went blind for some time, after which a cardiac arrest was recorded. The astronauts regained consciousness after the parachute system went off. Incredibly, their bodies were able to withstand the inhuman load. Although, had they lasted a little longer, the crew of Union 18 would have been dead. Coming to his senses, Lazarev saw that the flight engineer was shouting something to him. However, nothing was clear. For some time, hearing was completely lost. The astronauts tried to contact the Mission Control Center. They needed to understand where the descent module would land. Communication was very poor. The crew could not hear the mission control center. But in the MCC, they could clearly hear what was going on and what the astronauts were talking about. "Oleg, where are we landing?" asked the ship's commander. "Apparently, to China or the Pacific Ocean," replied the flight engineer. Then he swore and spoke very unflatteringly about the work of the engines of the second stage. He did not know at the time that Valentin Glushko, chief designer of space systems, had heard his words. Hearing the flight engineer's criticism, Glushko became furious. With a flushed face, he immediately ordered to switch off broadcasting and, not being shy in his words, promised that he would do everything to prevent Makarov from flying into space again. According to the crew's calculations, if the second stage failed, they would have had to crash land in Altai if they were unlucky in China, with which the Soviet leadership had very strained relations at the time. If the third stage failed, the crew would have fallen into the Pacific Ocean. The landing site was lucky, and although the cosmonauts landed in an inaccessible area southwest of Gorno-Altiisk, it was Soviet territory. It would seem that everything was behind us, but suddenly a new threat appeared. The point is that according to the instructions, the crew should have shot off the parachute after landing. However, at this point the rescuers contacted the astronauts, who gave the crew an unofficial instruction: first look around very carefully, and then shoot the parachute. Specialists, who learned by bitter experience, knew very well when landing in mountainous areas. After firing the parachute, the descent vehicle could roll down a slope or fall into a gorge. This saved the lives of Makarov and Lazarev. They got out and looked around. The descent vehicle was lying on a mountain slope. There was a huge chasm very close by. The only reason the parachute had not rolled away was that it was entangled in the treetops. Snow was deep and the temperature dropped to -7 degrees. Rescuers could not get close to the Lazarev and Makarov crew. After the monstrous landing, the crew now had to survive on the ground. The helicopter that flew up to the landing point, after repeated attempts, was unable to pick up the cosmonauts. Another accident followed. A group of rescuers attempting to reach the freezing crew was hit by an avalanche. Now it was them who had to be rescued. A day later, one of the Air Force helicopters, which was not part of the search party, at the cost of incredible effort and risk, was finally able to pick up the astronauts and take them to safety. This story turned out to be classified for many years. It was not customary in the Soviet Union to sanctify failed launches and accidents. According to recollections of eyewitnesses, as soon as they realized that the flight did not go according to plan, they ordered to remove all journalists from Baikonur. For the second flight, the cosmonauts were awarded the Gold Star of the Hero of the Soviet Union. However, due to the fact that it was customary not to talk about this incident, Makarov and Lazarev were only given the Order of Lenin. It was as if the flight had never happened. The number of the wrecked ship Soyuz 18 was taken away and assigned to the next spacecraft. In reality, however, everything looked quite different. That flight had not passed without leaving a trace. The astronauts started to have health problems. Lazarev never went into space again. For health reasons, he was dismissed from the armed forces and expelled from the cosmonaut corps. He died in 1990. At that time, he was only 62 years old. Oleg Makarov experienced serious heart problems. In 1998, he had an operation, but could not recover. In 2003, he died of a heart attack. The dramatic story and the heroic flight of 1975 remain unknown to most people to this day. Subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends. Give it a thumbs up. Write in the comments about what else interesting you can tell about this video. See you in the new video.
In early September 1969, A unique archaeological find was made in the village of Rzavchik, Russia, Tisulsky district, Kemerovo region, in the local coal mine. In the coal seam, at a depth of more than 70 meters underground, the miner Karnakov, who later died under the wheels of a motorcycle, discovered a long marble sarcophagus, surprisingly precise and finely crafted. By order of Alexander Alexandrovich Masalagin, died in 1980, the official version was stomach ulcer. All work in the mine was immediately stopped. The sarcophagus was lifted to the surface and began to open it, removing the fossilized seal around the edges. Not so much from the pressure, but from the heat of the sun, this special sealing compound gradually turned into a clear liquid. One of the workers even tasted it on his tongue. He went crazy for a week and then froze at the door of his house in February. The lid of the coffin fit perfectly into the 15 centimeters thick walls, but the opening itself was a real shock to all onlookers. The sarcophagus was filled to the brim with a pinkish-blue, crystal-clear liquid, under which lay a tall, about 180 centimeters, slender woman of extraordinary beauty, about 30 years old, with fine European features and large wide-open, blue eyes. Thick, dark brown curls with a reddish tint reached her waist, and delicate, white hands with short, neatly trimmed fingernails lay loosely along her body. She was dressed in a snow-white lace dress, transparent, just below her knees, with short sleeves embroidered with colorful flowers. She wore nothing else. She did not seem to be dead, but asleep. The lid of the sarcophagus still contained a black rectangular round metal box measuring about 25 centimeters by 10 centimeters. The sarcophagus was open to the public from about 10 a.m. to 3 p.m., and the entire village came to see the miracle. The discovery was immediately reported to the district town as well. Firefighters, the army, and the police arrived. A helicopter flew in, and a group of men in civilian clothes emerged, who said the place was contagious and ordered those present to leave the grave. Then they cordoned off the site and recorded everyone who had touched the coffin and those who were standing nearby, ostensibly for an urgent medical examination. They tried to load the sarcophagus into the helicopter, but the burden was too heavy, so they decided to remove the liquid. But when the liquid was pumped out, the body began to turn black before their eyes. So the liquid was immediately put back in, and the blackness quickly disappeared. A moment later, the woman's cheeks blushed and her entire body regained its original appearance. The sarcophagus was sealed and transferred to the helicopter, along with the rest of the mastic in a cellophane bag. Then they ordered people to disperse. The helicopter lifted off and disappeared in the direction of Novosibirsk. After some time, an elderly professor came to Rzavchik from Novosibirsk, who gave a lecture in the village club about the preliminary results of laboratory research. He said that this discovery would fundamentally change the entire understanding of history. In the near future, Soviet scientists would publish their findings, and it would cause a shock in the scientific world. The unknown woman, according to the professor, was buried millions of years ago. And this is a serious crack in Darwin's theory. The woman was buried in the ancient Paleolithic, in Carboniferous times, millions of years before the dinosaurs, long before the formation of hard coal, when by modern concepts there was a plant kingdom on Earth. Originally the coffin stood in the middle of a wooden vault of a deep forest thicket. Over the centuries, the vault, along with all the surrounding plants, sank into the ground, and a monolithic coal seam existed without access to oxygen for hundreds of millions of years. Initially, an extraterrestrial version of the woman's origin was substantiated, but genetic analysis of the body showed a 100% match with modern Russian man. Today we are exactly the same as our ancestors millions of years ago. However, the level of civilization to which the woman belonged surpasses everything known, including our own, because, for example, the nature of the fabric from which her dress was sewn is not accessible to any modern scientific analysis. The equipment for making this material is not an invention of mankind. Even the composition of the pink-blue liquid has not yet been determined, only some of its basic elements, derived from old varieties of onions and garlic, have been identified. The professor said nothing about the metal box, but it has been studied. A few days later, the local newspapers published a short note about an archaeological relic discovered near the village of Rzavchik, which throws a new light on history. The locals were surprised. Only 3 lines were published in the local newspaper and nothing more. Slowly, everything would have been forgotten, but soon the Tisulsky district was suddenly cordoned off by the military. The police marched through the yards confiscating the outrageous newspaper number from the population, and the place where the coffin was found was carefully dug up and covered with earth. Nevertheless, one citizen had the courage to write a letter to the Central Committee of the Communist Party, but died without waiting for a reply, officially, from heart failure. Then, within a year, one by one, all 6 other discoverers of the coffin died in car accidents, all the direct witnesses to the original discovery of the coffin being silenced forever. In 1973, when the authorities thought things had calmed down, extensive summer excavations were conducted on the shores and islands of Lake Berchikal, which stretches only 6 kilometers from the site of the sarcophagus discovery, throughout the summer until late fall. The site was surrounded by soldiers and police. One of the workers involved in the excavations, though in a drunken state, said that some ancient cemeteries, possibly of the Stone Age, had been discovered on the islands. True, he refused to share the details, but people had seen both the excavations and the brick-colored helicopter. Local residents knew only one thing: they had found Stone Age graves. The journalist who wrote about this find suddenly reappeared and said that he had suffered because of this publication, was persecuted by the FSB, almost died, and was forced to stop his journalistic activities. Subsequently, one of the central TV channels told about the Tisul find. In the film, the TV reporters added 2 more sarcophagi found in Berchikal. True, the age of the finds has dropped from 800 million years to 200 million years. But overall, the story remained unchanged. The trouble is that there was not a word of truth in it. To begin with, no blasting operations could be carried out at the coal mine in 1969 because instead of the mine was an open pit and coal was not mined there on an industrial scale for 30 years. There are no islands on Lake Berchikal, no mounds around the lake, which was allegedly dug in 1973. But there are mounds and a cemetery of the Stone Age near the village of Rzavchik. The Stone Age is limited to 300 million years ago. No princess could have survived in the most reliable sarcophagus for so many years and certainly could not be ethnically Russian. There was no genetic expertise in 1969, and there could not be. However, journalists simply dug up the publications of the 70s of the last century about the discovery of the Tisul Princess and reprinted, almost without changing the style, but combining the facts from the numerous notes of that time into a kind of unified whole. And then the information about the mysterious artifact in the publications did not coincide. First, the place of the find itself changed. Second, the person who discovered the sarcophagus changed. Third, it is unknown what happened to the coffin and to the liquid, but it ended the same way: the princess was loaded and taken away. Local residents, with whom professional journalists tried to talk after the publication, could not recall a single archaeological find that even remotely resembled the story of the sarcophagus. In fact, quite truthful witnesses described several open graves with the dead that looked like the living. The most famous in a series of these accounts is the discovery in the Middle Ages during work on the Appian Way of the tomb of Marcus Tullius Cicero's daughter. The girl's coffin was filled with clear embalming fluid, and she herself slept with a blush on her cheeks, in perfectly preserved clothing, and at the foot of the tomb was lit by an eternal lamp. But as soon as fresh air entered the tomb, the lamp went out. The frightened medieval people immediately closed the tomb. Other similar cases are also known. Chroniclers told that beautiful girls were sometimes dragged out of the tombs and tried to wake them up. Once in the air, the bodies began to turn black and decompose. Archaeologists, too, are sometimes lucky enough to make an unexpected discovery. In 1971, Chinese researchers discovered a tomb in Hunan province. Inside was the mummy of a noble Chinese woman, Xin Zhui, perfectly preserved to this day. It had lain in 4 nested sarcophagi under thick layers of coal and clay for 2,000 years. And what is very interesting, the body of the old woman was completely immersed in the yellow preservative liquid. But as soon as the tomb was opened, the embalming compound evaporated. Notes about the miraculous liquid, the marble sarcophagus, and the imperishable body from Rai appeared immediately after the discovery of Xin Zhui's tomb. But the article that made the fuss was most likely based not on the story of a medieval chronicler and not on a Chinese artifact, but on a very real discovery of a perfectly preserved Yukok princess discovered in Altai in 1993. Princess, or rather a young shamaness who died in the 3rd century BC, looked as alive thanks to another preservative liquid, ordinary water, which had turned into ice. But once the ice began to melt, the princess began to turn black and her clothes began to disintegrate. Only the skillful actions of archaeologists were able to prevent the loss of the rare find. Why did journalists decide to resurrect the records from many years ago? Precisely because it is very close, in the Altai, lived very real Princess Yukok. In the post-war years, the USSR was actively developing the Arctic and the eastern regions of the country. The experience of expeditions showed that, in order to expand the Arctic transport system and increase the number of cargo shipments, icebreakers capable of working in the ice for a long time were needed. Initially, steam icebreakers were used for navigation on the northern seas, and their fuel was enough for about 3 weeks of autonomous voyage without refueling. A little later, the Navy changed over to diesel-powered icebreakers, which could operate for up to 50 days without refueling. However, even this autonomy was not enough, and there were cases when caravans had to spend the winter in the Arctic ice due to running out of fuel on the icebreaker. At the same time, the country was actively improving the nuclear power industry, which gave a powerful impetus to the development of the Arctic transport system. According to specialists' calculations, the incorporation of a nuclear power unit into the icebreaker would increase the autonomy of the ship up to 12 months. Staking on new technology, on November 20, 1953, the USSR Council of Ministers decided to build the world's first nuclear-powered icebreaker, Lenin. The ship was laid down in 1956 at the shipyard in Leningrad and solemnly launched on December 5, 1957. As you know, the launch was not the end of the ship construction, and the tugboats took the icebreaker to the dockyard. For the next 2 years, the nuclear reactors were installed and various tests were carried out. Only in December 1959 the icebreaker was successfully delivered to the Ministry of the Navy and put into operation. Already during the first navigation through the northern seas, the nuclear icebreaker Lenin showed excellent autonomy due to the nuclear power plant capacity. Thus, the problem of expanding the transport system and increasing the navigation time in the Arctic was solved. Incidents on the icebreaker. Initially, the nuclear icebreaker Lenin used the OK-150 nuclear power plant, which, according to the recollections of engineers and project participants, had many drawbacks and proved to be not as reliable as it was designed to be. As a result, the icebreaker was under repairs for a considerable, if not most of the time. Several incidents in the icebreaker's reactor plant between 1965 and 1967 are described in the literature. However, it is not known reliably what levels on the International Nuclear Event Scale they correspond to, and whether even one of them can qualify as a full-fledged accident. In February 1965, the icebreaker was repairing the main circulating pumps of Reactor 2. In the process, due to operator error, water circulation briefly stopped, resulting in overheating of the reactor core. The unloading of spent nuclear fuel was stopped, and it was decided to unload the remaining fuel assemblies into a special protective container along with part of the reactor structures. 2 years later, the sealed container was loaded on a pontoon and taken to Tsivolki Bay near Novaya Zemlya, where it was submerged. According to the recollections of A. Adrianov, deputy chief of the INC service on the nuclear icebreaker Lenin, during the navigation season in the fall of 1965 a leak was detected in the first circuit of Reactor 3. One of the 2 steam generators failed after only 3,000 hours of operation due to an inserted stainless jacket, which was supposed to protect the internal surface of the vessel from corrosion for several decades. As a result, the second steam generator was only able to deliver half of the reactor's normal capacity until the end of the navigation. Adrianov also recounts 2 incidents that occurred on the icebreaker in 1966. At the beginning of the year, a major fire broke out on the icebreaker due to a breach in welding technology, destroying the cable runs. In summer, a new leak of stainless steel corrosion-resistant jackets was detected on reactor number 1, and not on the steam generator, but on the reactor power vessel itself. It was impossible to remove it without replacing the reactor along with the entire reactor. According to information from Bologna, as early as 1967, according to other sources, preparations to dismantle the reactor compartment began in late 1966. The leakage of the pipeline of the third circuit was detected in one of the reactors. During the opening of the unassembled concrete biological shielding, to find out where the leak was, serious mechanical damage was allegedly done to the reactor equipment. Because of the numerous shortcomings of the first-generation nuclear power plant, it was decided to modernize it. Since by that time considerable experience had been accumulated in the operation of the nuclear icebreaker Lenin, other offshore nuclear power plants, and onshore nuclear power plants, there was an option to replace the OK-150 unit with a more advanced and modern modification of the OK-900. According to different versions, the decision to replace instead of repairing and upgrading the existing reactors was made after the accident in the fall of 1965, summer of 1966 or early 1967. It was documented by the decree of the USSR Council of Ministers on the 18th of February 1967. Preparation for the operation. Heavy radiation conditions and tight schedule of repairs did not allow to dismantle the reactor plant inside the icebreaker. In the course of the operation, about 6,500 people could have been exposed to the maximum permissible annual rate of radiation. Therefore, to remove the OK-150 unit, it was necessary to look for more radiation-safe ways. The specialists considered various options for removing the reactor through the top deck or over the side of the nuclear ship to a floating craft or to the shore. However, after flooding the plant with a special solution for biological shielding, the weight of the reactor was too high. Moreover, together with the reactor, one wanted to unload all the equipment and constructions inside the icebreaker, which were radioactively contaminated and were not suitable for the new OK-900 reactor. After studying all possible options, there was only one left: to extract the reactor through the icebreaker's bottom by means of spot explosions. The whole operation was planned to be realized in 5 main stages. Stage 1. Preparatory work to disconnect the reactor from the icebreaker hull in a special coastal base near Murmansk. Stage 2. Icebreaker towage to the place of unloading and reactor burial in Sivolki Bay. Stage 3. Preparatory underwater work on the icebreaker in the operation area. Installing charges. Carrying out detonation and unloading the compartment to the bottom. Stage 4. Towage of the icebreaker, escorted by ships of the Northern Fleet back to Murmansk. Stage 5. Dispatch of the nuclear icebreaker to the dock for assembling new bottom sections. The main difficulty of the operation at the planning stage was the 4 bulkheads that held the entire compartment with the reactor. In case of cracks or uneven explosion of charges, the compartment could have become warped and would have started to buckle right inside the icebreaker, with no way to get out of the hull downward. As a precaution, additional supports were added to the compartment to prevent warping, and each fuse was equipped with additional power circuits to ensure that all charges were detonated simultaneously. Before the operation, the Krylov Central Research Institute used a 150 scale model to study the behavior of the compartment after detonation, and the charges were tested on a 1/5 scale model. Cutting out the heart. After all the tests and preparatory work, the icebreaker, in tow in the company of the Leps, and the rescue vessel Altai-1, headed for Novaya Zemlya, in Sivolki Bay, to the reactor unloading site. All the operations of the 3rd stage of retrieving the reactor were fulfilled from September 8 till September 19, 1967. Back to Murmansk, the icebreaker was towed with the bottom cut out and flooded, due to which the towing speed was limited. 7 days later, on September 26, the Lenin reached Murmansk, and on October 5 it was docked to restore the bottom. A month later the work was completed, and the icebreaker went to the Zvezdochka plant in Severodvinsk to install the new OK-900 nuclear power plant. The future of the nuclear-powered icebreaker. The reactor replacement work was fully completed 2 years later. Since the design of the new nuclear plant differed from the previous one, and now there were 2 reactors inside instead of 3, 204 of 675 rooms had to be modernized on the nuclear submarine. However, everything was a success, and after the tests on June 21, 1970, an acceptance report was signed, as a result of which the icebreaker Lenin, with a new heart, was again on duty in the Arctic. After replacing the nuclear plant, the Lenin worked for 19 years more. Due to heavy wear of the hull from 1984, the icebreaker was used only during the most favorable navigation period from June till December. 5 years later it was decided to fully withdraw it from service, and by that time more modern vessels for work in the Arctic had appeared. The nuclear icebreaker's propellers were dismantled, the ice reconnaissance helicopter was removed, and the reactors were mothballed. After that it was placed on perpetual anchorage in the port of Murmansk. During the time of work in the Arctic, Lenin has led 3,741 ships through the ice, and he himself went more than 1.2 million kilometers, of which 1.037 million in the ice, taking part in 26 navigations. Currently, the icebreaker has a museum and an information center of Rosatom. Since 2016, the nuclear icebreaker has been recognized as a cultural heritage object of federal significance. It has a crew and a captain. They give tours several times a day, though not all the compartments. As they said on the spot, it is planned helicopter model from above, sort of looking for a decommissioned helicopter to put it on the site, and now there is also dismantled part of the crew quarters and made an interactive exhibition, in particular, how polar bears open cans of condensed milk dropped from the icebreaker tourists. If you are in the area, be sure to stop by. If you were interested, thank the author by putting a like. And also do not forget to subscribe so as not to miss the outputs of even more interesting videos of my channel. Turn on notifications by clicking on the bell and share this video with your friends. What else interesting can you add to this video? Write in the comments, it will be interesting to read.